In 1776, 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence, a document that annulled the British monarchy in the newly founded United States. This was the beginning of the American experiment in democracy, which became a vital part of the American identity. Since then, America has stood by its democratic values through its domestic and international policies.
In the Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The Iron Curtain was a menace to the prospect of democracy in Europe immediately following World War II. It was an ideological, political, and militaristic boundary between the Soviet Union's communist regime and the free, democratic, American-supported nations of Western Europe. One of the tensest areas of post-World War II Europe was the joint occupation zone of Berlin. Berlin was occupied by America and her democratic allies, which believed in the protection of the rights of the people of their occupation zones in East Berlin, as well as the Soviet Union, which enforced a communist regime upon its occupation zone of West Berlin. In an effort to stamp out democracy in the entirety of Berlin, the Soviets put a blockade around the city. The U.S. and its allies began the Berlin airlift 2 days later to protect East Berlin from the growing threat of communism.
But Germany, is split amongst the major powers, Britain, France, Soviet Union, and us. And so we do give a lot of financial support to it and manpower that we're able to do because we can go through East Germany and into Berlin. The problem came about is when the Berlin blockade by Stalin occurred. We physically had to figure out how to supply our section of Berlin, West Berlin, and we did that through airlifts. And he did that for 11 months, and that containment policy was successful. While it did take 11 months, and a lot of manpower from the military and others that are supplying charities and food and Christmas gifts and things like that, it did take, quite a while, but it was successfully done there.
The Berlin airlift cost the U.S. $224 million and delivered over 2.25 million tons of food, fuel, and other supplies. Due to the unwavering support of democracy by America and her allies, the Soviet Union ended the blockade almost a year later. Berlin became the symbol of America's desire to protect the world by upholding democratic ideals.
After the end of World War II, the United States led the Allies in the occupation and rehabilitation of Japan, implementing widespread economic, political, and social reforms. General Douglas MacArthur, head of the Supreme Command of Allied Forces, dismantled the Japanese military and forbade military officials from ever holding political office. SCAP also introduced land reforms designed to reduce the power of wealthy landowners who also supported the war and benefit the majority tenant farmers. In 1947, Allied advisors essentially laid down a new constitution for the Japanese government. The more extreme changes in the document included demoting the status of the emperor to a figurehead without political control, forsaking the right to wage war, and placing more power in the parliament. With the United States' contribution, Japan's industries swiftly recovered, giving itself the name economic miracle.
MacArthur does a lot of different things in Japan, particularly with trying to demilitarize Japan, rearranging their government. They instituted democratic principles, created a constitution for Japan called the MacArthur Constitution.
The civil rights movement in America focused primarily on attaining equality for all African Americans. The movement accentuated issues of racial discrimination, such as freedom and voting rights, along with social and economic equality.
Right after the war, the military is really one of the first places to be desegregated, and then that starts to seep into kind of the rest of life. But we already know that up to this point, the Jim Crow era has been around for decades. Segregation and discrimination is pretty prevalent. There's still things that prevent people from voting despite the 15th Amendment being in place. And those things are poll taxes and grandfather clause. The literacy test is still around mid-20th century as well. So there are a lot of things, especially with democratic policies and the ability to vote, that are still around that the civil rights movement will start to address.
Many activists established resistance methods in order to bring about change. For instance, a march known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was organized to bring attention to the civil rights and its many components. Also, Martin Luther King Jr. presented his renowned I Have a Dream speech at this march, which called for racial tolerance among all. At the time, John F. Kennedy was trying to pass the Civil Rights Act through Congress, and this march further facilitated his case.
In summation, America has protected its democratic ideals throughout history by containing non-democratic philosophies. It protected the people of West Berlin from the communist regime of the USSR. It used democracy to give Japan an economic boom that lasted for several years. It expanded universal voting rights to blacks and women regardless of their ability to read or pay to vote. It has begun to expand voting rights to ex-felons. America may not have perfectly defended democracy throughout its lifetime, but it has always been determined to uphold democracy across the globe.